What if the man who has dominated Russian politics for more than 2 decades is finally losing his grip? What if the war that Vladimir Putin expected to reshape Europe is now reshaping Russia itself? And what if the European Union, once criticized as divided, weak, and slow, now believes Putin is facing the weakest moment of his entire presidency? That is exactly what European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said this week. According to Kallas, Putin is now in a weaker position than ever before. The statement came after European ministers discussed the changing dynamics of the Ukraine war, Russia's internal struggles, and growing pressure on the Kremlin. But is this really true? Because on the surface, Putin still controls Russia. He still commands one of the world's largest militaries. Russia is still exporting energy, and Moscow continues attacking Ukraine. So why would European leaders suddenly believe the balance is shifting? In today's video, we'll break down why the European Union thinks Putin is weakening, what is happening inside Russia's economy and political system, why the Ukraine war may be turning into a long-term disaster for Moscow, how sanctions, military losses, and global isolation are affecting the Kremlin, and most importantly, what happens next if Putin's position continues to weaken. Because this story is not just about Russia, it is about the future of Europe, NATO, global power politics, and the New World Order. Let's begin. This week, European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas made a dramatic statement. She said, "I think the overall understanding is that Putin is in a weaker position than he has ever been before." That is not a small claim. This is the European Union talking about a leader who has survived. NATO expansion, Western sanctions, domestic protests, economic crises, internal rebellions, and more than 2 decades of geopolitical confrontation. Yet European officials now believe the Kremlin is under serious strain. According to Kallas, Russia is not winning on the battlefield the way Moscow expected. At the same time, dissatisfaction inside Russia is growing. Russian influencers, military bloggers, and even nationalist voices have become increasingly critical of how the war has been managed. Internet restrictions inside Russia are expanding, censorship is increasing, and the Kremlin appears more defensive than confident. But here's the important part. The European Union is not saying Putin is about to collapse tomorrow. Instead, they are saying something potentially more significant. Putin may still have power, but his strategic position is becoming weaker. And those are two very different things. Authoritarian systems often appear strong on the outside right before they become unstable. History has shown this repeatedly. The Soviet Union looked powerful until it suddenly wasn't. The same thing happened with many centralized regimes throughout history. The real question is not whether Putin still controls Russia. The real question is whether he can continue controlling Russia at the same cost. And that cost is rising every single month. To understand why Europe thinks Putin is weakening, we need to go back to February 2022. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin expected a rapid victory. Many analysts believed Kiev could fall within days. Putin likely expected Ukrainian resistance to collapse, Western unity to break apart, Europe to remain dependent on Russian energy, and NATO to remain cautious. Instead, almost the exact opposite happened. Ukraine resisted. The West united, NATO expanded, Europe accelerated military spending, and Russia entered a grinding war of attrition. Now, after years of fighting, the conflict has transformed into one of the most expensive geopolitical gambles in modern Russian history. Russia has suffered enormous military losses, thousands of armored vehicles destroyed, aircraft lost, elite units depleted, and an economy increasingly redirected toward war production. Even though Russia still occupies territory and continues advancing in some areas, the war has not delivered the decisive victory Putin originally imagined. Instead, Russia is trapped in a costly conflict with no clear ending, and wars without clear endings are dangerous for authoritarian governments, because time becomes the enemy. The longer the war continues, the more economic pressure builds, the more soldiers are lost, the more public fatigue grows, and the harder it becomes to maintain the image of inevitable victory. That image is extremely important for Putin. His political system depends heavily on strength, stability, and control. Putin built his reputation on restoring Russian power after the chaos of the 1990s. For years, he projected himself as the man who made Russia respected again. But long wars can slowly damage that image, especially if ordinary Russians begin asking, what exactly are we gaining from this? Now let's talk about the economy, because wars are not only fought on battlefields, they are fought in factories, banks, energy markets, and government budgets. Since the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has faced massive Western sanctions. At first, many people believed sanctions would immediately collapse the Russian economy. That did not happen. Russia adapted faster than expected. Oil exports continued. China and India increased energy purchases. Alternative trade networks emerged, and Moscow used capital controls to stabilize the ruble. For a while, Putin appeared to survive the economic storm. But surviving is not the same as thriving. Today, the Russian economy faces several major problems. First, inflation. Prices inside Russia have risen significantly. Second, labor shortages. Hundreds of thousands of Russians either joined the military, fled the country, or were absorbed into war industries. That has created serious pressure on civilian sectors. Third, dependency on military spending. Russia's economy is increasingly war-driven. Factories producing weapons and ammunition are active. Military contracts are flowing. But that creates an unhealthy imbalance. A wartime economy can boost short-term industrial output, but it often weakens long-term economic sustainability. Why? Because tanks do not improve civilian productivity. Missiles do not modernize infrastructure, and military spending alone cannot create balanced economic growth forever. Meanwhile, Russia's technology sector has suffered from restrictions on advanced imports. Many Western companies left the country. Foreign investment collapsed, and access to advanced semiconductors and industrial technology became far more difficult. Now combine all of this with falling living standards. This matters because Putin's social contract with the Russian people was relatively simple. You stay out of politics, and in return, the state provides stability and rising prosperity. But prolonged war puts that contract under pressure, especially for younger Russians. Many highly educated professionals left Russia after the invasion. This brain drain may become one of the biggest long-term problems for the Kremlin, because countries do not compete only with weapons. They compete with innovation, technology, talent, and human capital, and losing skilled citizens weakens future growth. Now let's move to perhaps the most important part of this entire story: internal stability. For years, Putin maintained control through a combination of nationalism, centralized authority, economic stability, media dominance, and elite management. But wars create pressure inside every political system, and Russia is no exception. One of the biggest warning signs came with the Wagner mutiny in 2023. Yevgeny Prigozhin, once one of Putin's closest allies, launched an armed rebellion against Russia's military leadership. For a moment, the world watched something extraordinary. An armed Russian force marched toward Moscow. Even though the rebellion eventually collapsed, the event shattered a major illusion. It showed that cracks existed inside the Russian power structure. That moment was psychologically important, because authoritarian governments rely heavily on the perception of absolute control. Once the perception of invincibility weakens, new doubts begin to emerge. Since then, the Kremlin has increased surveillance, censorship, and security measures. Russian media has become even more tightly controlled. Criticism of the war can lead to prison sentences. Independent journalism has been crushed. Opposition figures have been jailed, exiled, or silenced. But repression itself can sometimes indicate insecurity. Confident governments usually do not need constant emergency controls. The more pressure the Kremlin applies internally, the more analysts begin asking whether Putin is governing from strength or from fear. And then there is another important issue: elite loyalty. Putin's system depends not only on ordinary citizens, it also depends on oligarchs, military leaders, intelligence agencies, and political elites. As long as these groups believe Putin guarantees stability, they support him. But if the costs of war continue rising, some factions may quietly begin questioning the long-term direction of the country, not publicly, at least not yet, but internally. And in authoritarian systems, elite uncertainty can become extremely dangerous. Now here's the other side of the story. Why does the European Union suddenly sound more confident? Because Europe itself has changed dramatically since the war began. Before 2022, many people criticized Europe for being militarily weak and overly dependent on Russian energy. That criticism was partly true. Germany depended heavily on Russian gas, Europe lacked military coordination, and many NATO countries had reduced defense spending for decades. But the invasion of Ukraine changed European thinking almost overnight. European governments realized something important. Dependence on Russia had become a strategic vulnerability, so Europe started adapting. Russian gas imports were reduced, alternative energy sources were developed, military budgets increased, defense cooperation expanded. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states pushed Europe toward a much harder line against Moscow. Meanwhile, NATO expanded with Finland joining and Sweden moving closer to full integration. Ironically, one of Putin's biggest strategic goals was to weaken NATO. Instead, NATO became larger and more united. That is a major geopolitical setback for the Kremlin, and Europe now believes time may actually be working against Russia. Why? Because European economies, despite their own problems, are larger and technologically more advanced than Russia's economy. The European Union's combined economic power is vastly greater. If Europe remains politically united, Russia faces a difficult long-term competition. That does not mean Europe is invincible. Far from it. Europe still faces energy challenges, inflation, political divisions, migration pressures, and rising populism. But compared to the fears many Europeans had in 2022, the situation now looks different. Europe survived the initial energy shock. Ukraine survived. And Russia failed to deliver a decisive geopolitical victory. That alone has changed the psychological balance. Now let's zoom out, because this war is no longer only about Russia and Ukraine. It has become part of a much larger global transformation. The world is moving toward a more fragmented geopolitical order. The United States, China, Russia, Europe, India, Middle Eastern powers. Everyone is repositioning. And the Ukraine war accelerated this process. For Russia, the war pushed Moscow closer to China. China became a critical economic lifeline. Trade between the two countries expanded. But this relationship also created a new problem for Moscow. Russia increasingly risks becoming the junior partner in the relationship. Historically, Russia viewed itself as a global superpower. But economically, China is far larger. If Moscow becomes too dependent on Beijing, Putin may preserve short-term survival while weakening Russia's long-term strategic independence. At the same time, countries in the global south have taken mixed positions. Some refused to fully isolate Russia. Others continued trading with Moscow. This prevented the complete diplomatic collapse Western leaders originally hoped for. However, Russia still faces significant isolation from advanced Western economies. And over time, technological isolation matters, especially in areas like artificial intelligence, semiconductors, aerospace, finance, and advanced manufacturing. Modern power is increasingly based on technology, and prolonged isolation from advanced systems can weaken a country's future competitiveness. This is one reason why European officials believe Russia may face growing long-term problems even if it avoids immediate collapse. Now, we arrive at the most important question. Is Putin truly weaker than ever before? The answer depends on how we define weakness. If weakness means immediate collapse, then probably not. Putin still controls the Russian state. The opposition inside Russia remains fragmented. The security apparatus is powerful, and the Kremlin still controls media narratives across much of the country. But if weakness means reduced strategic flexibility, rising costs, and growing long-term pressure, then yes, there is strong evidence supporting Europe's argument. Think about it this way. Before the Ukraine war, Russia had deep energy leverage over Europe. NATO was less unified. Russia had stronger ties with Western economies, and Putin projected an image of unstoppable geopolitical momentum. Today, Europe reduced energy dependence. NATO expanded, Russia faces sanctions, and Moscow is stuck in a prolonged war. That is not the position Putin originally wanted. Even if Russia avoids defeat, the strategic environment has become much harder for the Kremlin. And there is another important factor: time. Putin is now governing during one of the most expensive periods of his presidency. The longer the war continues, the harder it becomes to sustain. Economic stability, military recruitment, elite unity, and public patience that does not guarantee collapse. But it increases risk. And geopolitics is often about managing risk. So where does this go from here? There are several possible scenarios. Scenario 1. The war continues for years. This is probably the most realistic short-term outcome. A frozen conflict, ongoing battles, no decisive peace agreement, and constant military pressure. In this situation, both Russia and Europe continue adapting to a long geopolitical confrontation. Scenario 2. Negotiations eventually emerge. European leaders say Russia is not yet genuinely ready for serious negotiations because Moscow still maintains maximalist demands. But if battlefield conditions change, or if economic pressure increases, negotiations could eventually become more realistic. However, any peace deal would be incredibly difficult. Questions over territory, security guarantees, sanctions, reconstruction, and NATO would remain unresolved. Scenario 3. Internal instability inside Russia increases. This is the scenario many governments quietly worry about. Because instability inside a nuclear superpower is extremely dangerous, a weakened Russia could become unpredictable. Power struggles inside the Kremlin could emerge. Regional tensions could grow. And global markets would react violently to uncertainty inside Russia. Ironically, even countries that oppose Putin do not necessarily want chaos inside Russia, because geopolitical chaos can spread quickly. Scenario 4. Russia doubles down. Instead of weakening politically, the Kremlin could intensify militarization and repression. Authoritarian systems sometimes become more aggressive when under pressure. That could mean more cyber warfare, more hybrid attacks, greater military escalation, and deeper confrontation with the West. This is why European governments continue increasing defense spending. They are preparing not just for today's war, but for a potentially more unstable future. Now here's the bigger lesson from all of this. Power in geopolitics is not only about military strength, it is about resilience, adaptation, economic endurance, technological capability, alliances, and legitimacy. Russia remains a major military power. No serious analyst should underestimate it. But the Ukraine war has revealed something important. Military force alone cannot guarantee strategic success, especially in a globalized world. The war transformed Europe. It transformed NATO. It transformed energy markets. And it transformed Russia itself. Even if Putin remains in power for years, Russia may emerge from this conflict fundamentally changed, more isolated, more militarized, more economically dependent on China, and more separated from Europe than at any time since the Cold War. That could become one of the defining geopolitical shifts of the 21st century. So, is Putin really in the weakest position of his presidency? The European Union clearly believes so. Not because Russia is collapsing tomorrow, not because the Kremlin has lost control, but because the long-term trajectory appears increasingly costly for Moscow. The war that was supposed to demonstrate Russian strength has instead exposed major vulnerabilities. Economic pressure, military losses, diplomatic isolation, internal strain, and rising uncertainty about Russia's future direction. At the same time, Europe, once seen as divided and hesitant, has become more unified than many expected. And that may be one of the biggest surprises of this entire conflict. But history rarely moves in straight lines. Powerful leaders often appear weakened and recover. Others appear invincible, until suddenly they are not. The future of Russia, Ukraine, and Europe remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. The geopolitical order that existed before 2022 is gone. And the world that emerges after this conflict may look completely different. Because this is no longer just a war over territory. It is a battle over influence, security, economic power, and the future balance of global politics. And whether Putin grows weaker or stronger from this point onward will shape the next decade of world history. What do you think? Is the European Union correct that Putin is weaker than ever before, or is Russia still far stronger than the West realizes? Comment below. If you enjoyed this deep geopolitical breakdown, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more global analysis. And remember, in geopolitics, perception can be just as important as power. Thanks for watching.